This is a £50 million note, not currently issued by the Bank of England, but nevertheless, that is £50 million that we give to various budgets every week. £50 million is, by the way, it's just a little bit more than just a little bit less than £2 for each taxpayer contributed every week. So I'm going to put this up as a visual reminder so that you can get a feel for how much money we might be talking about. But of course, added together across the entirety of the British tax base, this is an awful lot of money. And this is, without contest, £350 million. That is the gross cost of the European Union every week currently. So 100 million, 200 million, 350 million pounds that we pay every week. Now, there's a lot of contest as to whether or not that is the correct figure to be discussing with people. My feeling is that the gross cost is completely acceptable, but some say no, we should be using the net cost. That is, we should be taking out of the 350 million pounds a week the amount of money given to poor farmers under the Common Agricultural Policy, the regional aid, and perhaps the amount of money given to the richest farmers, some of the richest landowners in the UK. But it's appropriate, since that comes back to the UK, that we only consider the net, and the net is £200 million a week. And that is what we are going to consider. And then they go and spend that, of course, in the European Union on aid to Eastern European countries, in particularly in terms of infrastructure, the European Parliament, the European Commission aid, and the Drinks Cabinet in Juncker's head office. That's the amount of money that we send to the European Union each week, some of which comes back. Now, unfortunately, that's not likely to be the end of it. There are two reasons. Firstly, it appears that the net amount per week is likely to increase. I've heard a figure mentioned of £438 million a week. That would add a couple of those. And then, of course, there is the £39 billion divorce payment that is going to grant us access to the single market and the customs union on the same basis as currently for the 21 months between April 2019 and December 2020. So that adds another 400. In fact, let's add it all up together and we'll say that the whole lot, £850 million a week, substantially more than the 350 million, in fact. 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 850 million pounds a week. That is a lot of money, but an economist by the name of John Mills, a Labour Party supporter and entrepreneur, has gone for a much higher figure. Let's see how he underpins his figure. Well, he starts off with this amount of money here, and then he says, well, in addition, you've got to think of some other points. That is, that economically we have a disadvantageous relationship with the EU countries anyway. The first one is that in terms of remittances, there are monies being paid to and from Britain through the EU in terms of taxation and benefits payments and pensions and rents and so on. And that income is at the moment a deficit. It's actually an expenditure. And that counts for another £350 million a week. So that is 100, 200, 350 million pounds a week. That is the income deficit. That's in addition to the cost of the European Union itself. We are also paying out net on our very heavy trade deficit with the European Union. That's a goods deficit, and the goods deficit is 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 800, 900, 1 billion, 1.1 billion, 1.2 billion, 1.3 billion, 1.4 billion, 1.5 billion, 1.6 billion, 1.7 billion, 1.8 billion, 1.85 billion. That is our goods deficit every week with the European Union. Now, luckily, even though the EU's regulations are largely about goods rather than services, we do have a trade surplus in invisible earning services with the European Union, and that comes to 100, 200 and 50 million pounds a week. Now, strictly, since these are all costs, what I'll do is I'll take that off this pile here, and as you can see, that total there, now including the services surplus and the income and the goods and the actual payments we make to the EU, is turning into a considerable pile of money. Now, I'm now going to introduce you to the bigger notes in my son's board game collection, and they are, this is a £1 billion note, in other words, 1,000 million pounds every week. And that is equivalent to about £40 per taxpayer per week. And rather than this large pile of notes here, which I will put to one side so that you can see how enormous they are, we're just going to compare the overall total, which is well over £2 billion for the European Union, net of the small services surplus that we have with them. 2 billion, and compare that to some of the other budgets that we have the government paying out for. So one of them is, of course, defence, and whatever else one feels about defence, we're clearly going to need some in the future, perhaps not quite so many Trident nuclear weapons, but there we go. That is about 850 million pounds a week. 850 is what we spend on defence, including aircraft carriers, the new aircraft that we're buying from America. Now, unfortunately, I haven't got an 850 million pound a week note, so I'm going to just tear this one so you get a visual impression of how much defence is costing us relative to the various costs to do with the EU. And then we'll go on now to another large public service. One of the largest is, of course, school and education, and that comes to just a shade under £2 billion. That's 2,000 million pounds per week. I won't tear that one up, otherwise my son's going to get cross because we're going to run out of notes. And then the largest public service that we have is, of course, the National Health Service, and that one's considerably more expensive. We pay 2,700 million pounds a week on that service, so there we go, that's that. Oh no, I'm going to have to tear this one. So that's about that much on the NHS. And those are the public services done. There are other public services in the mix, but that's a comparison, the EU, between some other key ones. The largest single budget that we have with the in the government's expenditure is of course for pensions and benefits, and that's under a social protection heading in the government's budget, which comes to 4,450 million pounds a week. Now that is 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion, 4.5 billion pounds a week for pensions, benefits, universal credit and the like. Now, I hope that visual comparison makes it clear that our key problem with the EU is not just the fee, and it's not even the divorce bill, which all of which are considerable, most of one of those. The really big problem with the EU is our very large trade deficit, which even net of services is considerable. And that's why the control of commercial policy, control of international policy is more important even than the fee. It is the control over things like customs, tariffs, trade agreements and so on. This is why we should be leaving the European Union. And the amount that we have to go at is considerable. This is more, in fact, than the school's budget. It's a sizable proportion of it's over 2/3 of the NHS budget. It's over half the pensions budget. Our relationship with the EU is costing us hand over fist because mainly we have an enormous trade deficit with them. In fact, if we could sort out the trade deficit with the European Union, then we would be roughly in trade balance overall with everybody else. It is the deficit that we have with the European Union that is only going to be solved if we start setting policies independent of the European Union to govern our trade in a way that is less expensive.